Good afternoon and welcome to ICOF's Opportunity Zones webinar. This is Carrie McCann-Botel, President of the Iowa Council of Foundations. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about the Opportunity Zones provisions, regulations, and the importance of the effort to the field of philanthropy. We started this conversation as a topic at our October quarterly membership meeting, and there was interest from several ICOF members in continuing the conversation. Our goals for today's webinar are to learn about opportunity zones and the newly released regulations, identify tools available to help support your understanding of the provision, discover strategies that are being implemented by fellow funders that may work in your community, and to ask questions and share any additional needs you have related to this topic. On our call today, we will hear from Adam Northup, Senior Vice President at Locust Impact Investing. The conversation will focus on the roles foundations can play, and specifically the roles of community foundations as it relates to opportunity zones. I have everyone's line muted, so please use the chat box function on the webinar to submit any questions you have during our time together, and I will relay those to Adam so he can answer those throughout the webinar. And with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to Adam to get us started.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me and an opportunity to talk about opportunity zones. Before I dig in and share the agenda, just a couple things to start. For those of you that don't know, Locust is a relatively new institution that is part of Virginia Community Capital, which is a nonprofit bank and CDFI that is based in Virginia. Locust, the mission at Locust is to help philanthropy and most notably foundations across the country find ways to deploy their financial assets more locally. And we do work across the range from helping foundations just get into impact investing and what it takes and what they need to explore. To the other side of the spectrum, we actually manage funds and portfolios for foundations as well. So that's just a little bit about us. Myself in particular, I'm relatively new to the organization too. I have a background in finance and strategy. Actually, I think I even have a slide here that I'll let you all look at. I won't speak to it. But I'll tell you about my involvement in opportunity zones, which is back in the kind of June time frame, Virginia Community Capital and Locust felt the need to have a better understanding of the program and how both our clients and the institutions need to think about leveraging the program to help communities revitalize, generate wealth, improve quality of life, whatever it may be that the program could potentially offer. Since that time, I have spent a good chunk of time, not only in Virginia, but around the country with economic development, with local businesses, with national businesses, with funders, with wealth managers, and with a lot of foundations and philanthropy. And so I have a pretty good read on the market, especially as it pertains to socially oriented, mission-driven impact investing. And I'm happy to share quite a bit about that today, what I've seen and what I'm seeing now. I'm going to flip to the agenda now. And this is what we'd like to try to cover in the next 55 minutes or so. It'll basically be broken into two parts. One is I'll walk through as briefly as I can the program itself and how it works, so a bit of a 101 for those that aren't initiated. And then I'll spend the second part of the roughly hour we have talking about what we're seeing and roles that philanthropy can play, and just the general challenges and opportunities that exist to really wring some good out of this program for these communities that are in fact, by definition, distressed and underserved. So I will divide this in two and have sort of two stopping points for questions and answers. Please use the chat tool, as we're going to type in those questions, and Carrie and I will again pause in the middle, roughly in the middle, and at the end to answer those. Which is a good segue to a lot of you provided some early thoughts on what you would like to get out of this session, and that's displayed on the page that I just clicked to. I believe that I'll probably cover all of these as we go through, but to the extent that you submitted one of these questions and it didn't get answered, please make sure it shows back up in the question chat, and I will make sure to address it. These are fantastic questions, by the way, and I think show to me that a number of you, and maybe all of you, have at least started to explore what this program looks like and how foundations and local and regional community development groups need to come together to make this happen. So for the 101 part of this seminar slash webinar, I want to spend a few minutes just making sure everyone's caught up to speed on how this program works. And so looking at the next slide that I have displayed, there's really three elements to this program that you need to keep in mind. One is that that there are now designated opportunity zones, which are geographies, specifically census tracts, all around the country, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The second feature of the program is that you have an investment vehicle called an Opportunity Zone Fund, and this is a capital accumulation and deployment vehicle that I'll also talk more about, that gets tax benefits from investing in the third component of the Opportunity Zone program, which is a business or property inside an Opportunity Zone. Just some overarching comments on the program itself. As most of you know, it was part of the tax bill that was enacted at the end of 2017. It was, quite frankly, a bit of a surprise to most all of the stakeholders who really need to be part of driving this program. And so really from state government to philanthropy to economic development to private wealth groups where this is a particularly interesting play for their clients, we're really on their back foot, and in a lot of ways continue to be sort of all collectively on our back foot. And so the first step in that journey is really getting a higher level of awareness and information, and I think if nothing else, I hope you get that today. It is what would be called in kind of Washington, D.C. speak, a free market program. It is, there are very few rules and regulations, which actually in its own way causes problems. The original text of the law was maybe 10 pages, double-spaced, and so they've since released a number of proposed rules and regulations which provide a bunch more definition, but still, as tax programs go, it is very loosely defined with parameters that make it, on the good side, very flexible. On the flip side, also ripe for very financially return-driven investment that borders on the margins of potentially being fraudulent or having negative social impact in the communities that they're supposed to be helping. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about each of the three components of the tax program. I did want to pause and say one thing. I told Carrie at the outset that we'll send out these slides, so please don't feel like you need to take notes or screenshots And I'm happy as questions arise to track back to a particular slide. So looking at the next slide, I just want to spend a minute or two on the opportunity zones themselves. So when the law was passed, it gave instructions to each state to essentially nominate a number of census tracts that Treasury would then ultimately approve. The nomination process really only had a few parameters around level of income, meaning that they were meant to be low-income tracts. But other than that, the states had lots of flexibility to figure out what they would nominate. I don't know too much about the process that Iowa in particular went through, but most states that I've engaged with, and certainly I can speak to Virginia, an office out of the governor's office essentially reached out to the local economic development authorities and had each of them rank their preferred census tracts to be designated as opportunity zones. And that way there was fair representation from across the state. You can look at the map that I've cut and paste here, or there's a couple of interactive maps that are actually much better if you Google them, where you can look across the country and look at overlays of other programs. This is done, and by statute there is no way, or there is no remedy, I would say, that's prescribed in terms of switching out opportunity zones or creating another one or discarding one in terms of designation. And so for the next 10 years, barring an act of Congress, I think this is what we have. And we'll need to, or my guidance is just go with it, and we can have the debate when there's the opportunity around if they were the right tracks. But for now, there really is, as I see it anyway, really no way to address any tracks that either haven't been selected or maybe don't feel like they quite made the mark. I will say this on this slide, which is one of the nice features is this program can be used with any other program. There's no restrictions in terms of other tax credit programs at a state, local, or federal level, or other grant programs. Any incentive that you can think of can be layered and stacked with the opportunity zone. Flipping ahead, I'm going to talk a bit about the opportunity zone funds. When I say fund, I'm sure all of you, like I do, think of a large managed institutional construct, like a mutual fund, where you have a multitude of investors who are investing in a professionally managed and administrated pool of capital that then flows to a number of investments. And in fact, lots of opportunity zone funds will look like that. But fund could also be myself as an individual, just creating an LLC or another type of partnership or a corporation and calling it an opportunity zone fund and putting the appropriate funding in there. So it's really, just keep in mind when I say fund, it's really just a placeholder for essentially capital gains that otherwise would have been taxed. And the way that I would suggest everyone think about that is as simple as something like this, which is I've owned Apple. I'm just making this up, by the way. These numbers aren't real. I've owned Apple stock for a number of years. I want to sell my Apple stock. Normally, the gain, if I earned $100 on, in appreciation on my Apple stock, the federal government would tax me for that after I sold that stock, usually in the range of 20 to 25%. If I, instead of paying that tax, I have the option now of putting it into an opportunity zone fund, and I will get potentially a series of tax benefits depending how long I leave that capital gain in that fund and deploy it to an opportunity zone business or property, which I'll talk about. The interesting part about this, which is another example of the flexibility and sort of limited rules, is that These are self-certified funds. There's no pre-qualification that you need to have with the IRS or Treasury. Just annually, either an individual or a corporation or a partnership will likely fill out a 2-pager that confirms through a series of checkbox type of exercise that the fund is itself qualified and that it is deployed appropriately into an opportunity zone and an opportunity zone business or property. I've included on here there are some like penalties for not having at least 90% of the fund deployed into an opportunity zone business or partnership. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. You do have 180 days from the time that you sell your asset and generate a capital gain until you decide to put it into a fund or not. The next slide, in as simple as possible that I can do, details the tax benefits that an investor gets from having their capital gains put into an opportunity zone fund. The first is a deferral. You don't have to pay tax on that 20 to 25% of my capital gains as long as the cash, or excuse me, as long as the asset exists up until 2026 or at the end of 2026. At that point, if your opportunity zone fund still exists and is invested in an opportunity zone business and or partnership, you will have to recognize the capital gain and pay the tax. But if you kept it in there for at least 5 years, you get a reduction of 10%. If you keep it in an additional 2 years, you get a 15% reduction. So you can, by having your opportunity zone fund exist for 7 years, reduce that tax by 15%. That's the second benefit. The third benefit, which is the most interesting and the most financially appealing, is if you leave the opportunity zone fund in place, invested in the qualified opportunity zone and asset, any gains on top of the initial capital gain are tax-free when you dispose of that asset. So the way to think about that is, I like to use another loose example is, if I buy an apartment building in an opportunity zone for $100 and it's worth $200 after 10 years, and I sell it, and I've followed all the opportunity zone rules, first of all, that $100 of original capital gains will only be taxed on 85, but second, the additional $100 in gain that I have is tax-free. And so you have a very long horizon to get to a very hockey stick return. That's very purposeful. It's meant to get capital locked up in, very distressed communities for a long period of time. I'm not going to spend much time on the next slide, which has some timelines. I do encourage those who are interested to look at it in more detail afterwards. But there's just one fundamental point that I want to make, which is the way that this is structured, because of the 2026 automatic deferral date, for any investor to reap all of the tax benefits that they would like to have out of this program, they essentially need to decide by the end of next year to put their capital gain into an opportunity zone fund. So what does that mean? Bringing it up a level. I believe that most of the opportunity zone activity is going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years in terms of gathering the capital and immediately deploying the capital. There is a structural tax reason because investors will want all the benefits they can get, and that's what you're looking at on this page. But also there's probably some more macroeconomic reasons as you look at the economic climate in the U.S. And looming potential slowdown. So I think there's a real urgency that I want to make sure to get across today, which is both structurally and perhaps even macroeconomically, there's probably going to be a burst of opportunity zone funds and capital moving And then my guess is it'll start to slow down absent any sort of legislative correction that would enable tax benefits beyond the current prescription. The last component of the Opportunity Zone program, I've talked about the Opportunity Zones themselves, the census tracts. I've talked about the capital vehicle, which is the fund. The last piece is that capital needs to then invest in an Opportunity Zone property, and that property, it's essentially one of two things. It's a business or it's an actual tangible asset. And you can do that via vehicles like stock and partnership, of course, which is what this is meant to show. But I would say at its most fundamental level, think about it, it needs to be either an operating business or physical property that's located inside the zone. There's a lot of detail here in terms of some of the restrictions, but I'm just going to point out a couple things. First, let me bring it up a level, which is there's really 4 what I would call good use cases for Opportunity Zone investments. Number 1 is real estate, and that is the headline for most of what you read about in the news in terms of Opportunity Zones. This program, for better or for worse, is designed to really match well with the way real estate investment flows, real estate development happens. So real estate development, and both in terms of renovation but also completely greenfield, is a great use case. The second use case is just to start a new business inside an Opportunity Zone. The third use case I would say is if you have a business in an Opportunity Zone and want to expand it, this is a great way to get capital to do that. And the fourth good use case, I believe, is you have an operating business that is outside an Opportunity Zone, and you either relocate it into an Opportunity Zone or expand into an Opportunity Zone. If your business or development project is one of those 4 things, chances are you can make this program work for you and attract equity investment through Opportunity Zones to your project. There's just a couple other qualification criteria that's important for folks to know. One is you can't really self-deal, meaning you can't sell assets to yourself, or you can, but only if it's below a 20% stake. And second, if you are a real estate investor or a tangible property investor, you need to improve that property within 30 months by the amount by the cost basis, which can be described in a number of ways, but think about it as the market price that you bought the asset. So if I bought a house for $100 and $50 of it is the land and $50 of it is the actual real property, I would need to invest an additional $50 so that the cost basis would be at $150. That's also very intentional. It's to prevent real estate speculation and actually ensure that the capital flows result in improvement to the real property that's being invested in. The last thing that I would like to talk about before I pause and open it up for Q&A is that there are a number of proposed rules that are out in Washington, D.C. land right now. And in fact, there was going to be a hearing about them last week, but with the government shutdown, it has been postponed. Those rules are really, from a high level, I would say, if anything, they've really ensured that the program is very flexible. They've added some additional flexibility with things like working capital safe harbors, not including land and that substantial improvement test, for example. And confirming that it'll be a 2-page self-certification. So what I see in the proposed rules are just further clarification that, yes, this program is meant to be flexible and pretty much wide open. The disappointing part is that there still are no rules or features of this program to track what actually happens in these communities. there is no requirement or mandate for sure that there is wealth generation in these communities. There is no requirement or mandate that there is quality of life improvements of any way, shape, or form, even though that is the stated intent of the law. There is a lot of speculation that there may be a third round of proposed rules that include, to some degree, tracking of measures like that. But I do not think, even if there's tracking, that there will be mandates that there are metrics to be met. So that'll at least be helpful in terms of having some guidance on the effectiveness of the program and the potential negative consequences that come along with it. But it disappointingly won't help ensure that some of the more positive features of the program come to reality. So the second part of this webinar, I'll get into what we're seeing here at Locus, what I'm seeing, the challenges around that, the roles that foundation, philanthropy, other community groups can play, and some other point of views. But I'm going to stop now and see if there's any questions just on the program itself.
Adam, I'll give folks a couple minutes to submit questions here. I did just want to note that the process the state of Iowa used to determine the tracks they would use for Opportunity Zone was very similar to what you outlined. The Iowa Economic Development Authority formed a task force that helped with that ranking and nomination process. And I'm happy to share with the group in our follow-up email the link to the list in detail of those tracks and how they were selected. So I'll include that in our follow-up note. And I don't have any questions, so if you want to go ahead and move forward, I think that'd be fine.
Okay. This is probably going to be the more interesting part of the dialogue for the group anyway, but it just always helps to level set. I've found in these conversations to level set on the program itself. The slide that I've just clicked to is, I think, a very important point of view that not only I hold, but lots of socially oriented impact investment community holds, as well as most of the philanthropic institutions that I talk to who are really thinking about getting involved in the program. Right now there are, and a simple Google News search will show this to you, there are lots of large-scale national funds that are accumulating capital gains to deploy into large-scale urban real estate development projects. And those projects are largely about generating financial return for the investors. And I think that's going to be the reality, is that there's always the way this law is designed and the philosophy of and the policy philosophy that currently exists is such that imbalance is likely to stick. The challenge, I think, is how to, on the other side of the scale, this is a terrifically flexible program that could have some really cool and powerful impacts, catalytic impacts in these communities. But chances are there'll be smaller projects. There'll be less real estate focused. There are projects that will require technical assistance and other assistance as the level of sophistication with the investors and the businesses at play will likely be lower. Socially impact-oriented investment can come to the fore in that type of setting. And so our view at Locus is you're going to have this mismatch because of the sort of the structure of the program, the sophistication needed, where the wealth is coming from, et cetera. But our goal here is to help, how do you kind of tip that scale a little bit down on the right side and really, as I said early on, wring out some of the goodness of this program. I think philanthropy has a huge role to play in that, and I'll talk more about that. But I think without philanthropy, it's going to be difficult to tip that scale. Here is looking at the next slide, here is a bit more detail on the challenges that we see here at Locust with the type of investment that we would like to see in these communities. One I've already mentioned, which is thus far there is, I would say across the country as a whole, there's not as much focus on truly community revitalization and wealth building type of investment. There are pockets of it that is starting to come to the fore, which I'll talk about in a moment, that are really interesting models to share. But as a whole, it's a big challenge for any community. I travel all around the state of Virginia into much smaller communities, and I was just in one yesterday, and the residents, the business owners, the property owners all come from a place of wanting to improve their communities and are very excited about that, but have no line of sight to investors that are interested in that type of investment. And so one of the challenges is even where you have that excitement, helping to kind of link those things is difficult. The second thing is that there just isn't a lot of pipeline-ready projects in most of these opportunity zones outside of the big urban areas. They have been distressed in most places. They've been distressed communities for a long period of time, and efficient capital flow just doesn't exist. And so there's been really no buildup of pipelines that are ready to even go and ask for capital. The third thing I would say is there continues to be a real lack of awareness. And I'll go back to the community I was in yesterday. I think 99% of the audience, it was their first time even learning about an opportunity zone. And so there still remains this big challenge of getting communities to really understand how powerful a tool this can be in their economic development and economic agendas. The last thing I'll say, and I'm really going to come back to this one, which is inside all these communities, there just is a real lack of investing ecosystem. And so even if you have all these components, a really good community revitalization agenda, lots of projects, really good excitement and energy, you still don't have a lot of ways to connect to those things, especially to the investors that you either want locally, regionally, or nationally. So the next slide really kind of gets to a bit of the punchline in this conversation is what role can a foundation play, or philanthropy in general, or quite frankly, this could work for government, it could work for quasi-government institutions, it could work for any third party that really wants to play that might have some of these capabilities. But from a philanthropy perspective, I think there's sort of, in order from left to right, in increasing complexity and challenge, there are sort of four basic roles. One is just to do a lot of what you do as a foundation anyway, which is to know what the opportunity zones are, know what the program looks like, and ensure that the community is layering the potential of the program into their discussions. That fundamentally means making sure to have a seat at the table. And I think in most cases, that's true with any community foundation. You're part of the short Rolodex that any mayor has or any county commissioner, and you just need to make sure that you're also on that short list in the opportunity zone discussions because, and here's the reason why sometimes you fall off, is that this is a for-profit, tax-driven program, and at first glance, a foundation isn't an obvious place to bring into the mix. But as you'll learn as I go across to the right, as smarter leaders realize, philanthropy and foundations can play a pretty impactful role. The second place to play is to deploy assets. And when I say assets, I think of broadly as your own people inside your institutions, your physical assets, whether it's space, it's your connection to partners who maybe have space or resources to help with the community, or it could be actual financial assets, both in terms of grants or even in mission impact investing vehicles. The third place, which I'm going to talk more about, can be terrifically impactful, and it's to help get that local ecosystem going. So hang tight on that one. And then the fourth is actually helping create and get in place an Opportunity Zone Fund with a specific agenda and mission. And so let me talk about a couple of examples at this point. I've talked to a number of community foundations in particular who have quickly recognized their place in number one. And some of them has been kind of elbowing their way into local convenings and just being part of that conversation. Some of them have actually been the driving force behind convening and bringing together community champions, important business leaders, important investors, et cetera. And generally that has looked like physical convening of people to get things going. Number two, I've also seen some good examples of this, which is usually an outgrowth of number one, which is recognizing, okay, we need to do some follow-on next steps that bring people together to map out community agendas, to start to inventory potential investors, et cetera. And then in the last column, in terms of Opportunity Zone funds, I've had a few conversations with some foundations across the country, recognizing that they have a specific agenda in their community, whether it's an affordable housing program, for example, is one foundation that I know of, who would like to invest alongside that. They recognize the program is inside an opportunity zone, and they themselves, with some of their donor support, are thinking about kind of pulling together a fund and matching their own agenda to the fund's agenda to ensure that the capital flows directly to that mission. I have not seen any of those too far along yet. It is, as you probably know, those types of skill sets and capabilities, equity fund development, is not something that typically, is a capability that resides in a foundation, especially a community foundation. The next slide is, I think this is all pretty intuitive and instinctual to all of you, but this is why, certainly my view, why you as foundations and philanthropy can have a really powerful role. One is, unlike the potential national and regional investors that are going to start paying attention to these communities, you know what they need and can steer some of that agenda. Number two is, you also are, as I just described, you are on the short list of people who are driving the community agendas, and in particular have access to local government and local economic development institutions, as well as high net worth individuals and other high net worth philanthropy. The other thing I would say is philanthropy may be the only place, maybe government, that will be actively saying, if I'm part of this, there needs to be some social good that comes out of it. It can't just be financial return for a few. And so that, in some ways, may be the most important piece that you can bring to the table, is ensuring that that is part of the discussion. So I'm spending just a little bit of time on Opportunity Zone marketplaces, just to give you a bit more clarity on what our view is here at Locus, but also where we're seeing the best in terms of practices, kind of standing up opportunities and investment with impact in mind, is really helping put together what we're calling marketplaces. And there's basically 4 components to that. One is like actually having a place, both online, but also probably with convenings of people, where you're bringing investors and projects together. The second thing is a very deliberate building of the project pipeline, both what exists and encouraging what could exist. The third piece is really marketing the community, not just locally, but potentially nationally. Side note, I just did a quick analysis. There's over $16 billion in funds that have been publicly announced. So that, and I would probably at least double that for the ones that are private and not being announced. And that already exists, and all that capital is looking for somewhere to go. So they need to be connected to those communities that have good stuff going on. And then the last piece is, I think an important part of this marketplace is really having a lens into, okay, what is this investment intended to do? Is it intended to improve the health of the community? Is it intended to create jobs? Is it intended to reduce energy costs? Is it intended to help with housing shortage? Whatever you have, providing that social lens to it is another important piece. There are a couple foundations that I'm working with, as well as a state government, to install this type of construct. And in the next page, I'm going to share with you a couple places for you to go look at where this is starting to happen. One is out in Oregon. That's the one place where you're actually seeing philanthropy kind of take point at the beginning anyway, although it may, as I see what's happening there, the state is becoming more and more involved. In a number of cities across the country, you're starting to see the local government and economic development really understand that they need to build these marketplaces. At a state level, I would encourage you to take a look at what's happening in Alabama or Colorado, and soon, I hope, Virginia, I'll be able to add to this page as a bit of a beacon. I will say, with the exception of Oregon and all these other instances, the social impact mission lens is not as high as I would like to see it. And the next slide is, we're here to help. I'm not going to try to sell anyone on anything. So why don't I pause there? We have a good 15 minutes for questions, if you have any. And hopefully it was helpful nonetheless.
Great. Thanks, Adam. I do have a few questions that have been submitted. The first is, have you seen any community foundations establish an LLC to host a Community Opportunity Zone fund that's directed at their specific community plan?
So great question. I know of 2 community foundations that have talked about it. I don't know if they've gone all the way to doing it. Certainly, the setting up of the LLC is the easy part. It's actually the, deciding to create a fund and then deploying all the resources to, sell that agenda and gather that capital. I've seen a couple of examples where there's a high level of interest in doing that. Actually, I would say 3 now. I've seen 3 examples all across the country, not actually clustered anywhere. I have also been talking with a foundation or 2 about what they see is investing alongside funds, so finding funds and what they're investing in and actually using their assets alongside. And so that would be a separate instrument. It would not be an Opportunity Zone Fund instrument, but it would be an investment vehicle similar to that, depending on how it was set up, but just not with the tax I can't. I would love to be able to to name the foundations to point you to, but they're not publicly announced. Though one of them may be soon.
Okay, great. And if they do publicly announce and you want to share with me, I'd be happy to share that out with the group as a resource.
Yep.
Another question, you've touched a little bit on national investors who are potentially looking for new funds to invest in. A question from a local funder is, how do we access those individuals or market to them if we create a fund here locally?
So that's a great question. One overarching thing I will say is, as I mentioned, I've talked to a number of local wealth managers, and their clients, of course, are saying, hey, I know something about this new tax program. How can I get some of my capital gains into a more local fund? And I actually think there's already a local supply-demand mismatch, meaning that a lot of your donor bases probably would also love to, deploy some of their assets locally in this fashion. And as I've said, there just isn't a good market for that, and so there may be some hard work there to connect to those local offices, whatever they look like in your community. From a national point of view, what's really happening is these funds are going and actually, think about it this way. Think about wealth management at Prudential or Bank of America. Those groups are putting together these very large funds, or you have private equity-like outfits that have access to very high net worth folks, and they're putting together these funds. So they already have funds that exist. They're not looking to invest those funds into additional funds. They're looking to invest those funds into projects. And so I haven't heard of that approach yet, which this question suggests, which is, hey, we want to start a fund and attract national capital into that fund. The more valuable thing for the community might be is rolling up a group of projects that national level funding could push to. So that's a little bit of the state of affairs. I don't think it's it's a not doable thing, but there certainly isn't an established market for that particular setup.
Two questions came in that are a bit related. The first is the ROI for investors, just the tax benefit, and a second question is, are the expectations of returns a market rate?
Mm-hmm. Two great questions on the returns. So the one thing I'll say is, just from the 10,000-foot level, is you got to have a good project. The Opportunity Zone program is just going to be I view it as one tool that you can add to a good project, that's a potentially risky project, to help it get over the hurdle. It isn't going to be the end-all, be-all. And in fact, I think the best projects are going to be funded by some mix of Opportunity Zone funding, some mix of CDFI lending, some mix of granting, some mix of state incentives. You're going to want to package all those things together. And I just really encourage everyone to think of the Opportunity Zone program as one of those tools. It's a tool that by most models, I've seen a number of people model it out, including myself, which I'm happy to share, that probably improves the return on any investment you're doing over 10 years by 200 to 300 to 400 basis points, which over 10 years is substantial and very powerful, especially to appreciation-oriented assets. And so while it is only a tool, it is a tool that really has potential to get over those project hurdles for projects that typically, especially community investment-oriented projects, that have a tough time getting there. I think that in terms of market return versus below market rate return, it depends on the investor pool. Most of what you're seeing right now is only investors pouring money in, hoping to get a market or above market rate return. At the same time, there are a lot of investors who I think would be happy to concede some of that market rate return to have some good done in their communities. Those tend to be more locally oriented investors or social impact oriented investors. I think they're out there. I think it's, as I said, it's difficult for them to find projects to invest in. But it's a long way of saying I think there is a way to get investors who are willing to take a below market rate return with the investment being focused on specific community outcomes.
Great, thanks. Sort of a practical question here. Which piece comes first, in the investment fund or the specific development of the use for the fund?
It's what's happening in reality is funds, lots and lots of funds are being put together, but probably what needs to be happening is projects need to be put together, and the funds will find their way there. You don't technically need to have one happen before the other. There are some specific timelines around how long you have to put money in a fund and how quickly it needs to be deployed, which I'm happy to share offline to folks afterwards. But the reality is that there's just a huge lack of projects, and if I could urge communities at large where they should turn their focus is probably less on putting together the funds and more thinking about what they can deploy to.
Great, that's helpful. Another question just came in. You shared in one of your slides an example of a project for housing for small and medium social impact projects, and another slide mentioned health, workforce development, and some other potential ideas. This funder is wondering if you have examples of these that you might be willing to share as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of what I've seen isn't public yet, but most of what I have seen is real estate oriented. And an interesting part of for example, housing space is that some of the other tax credits and tax programs you can use ultimately don't require the equity that an Opportunity Zone fund has to offer. So that's just one challenge that I mentioned because I think it's one of the first things folks face. Most of what I've seen in terms of sort of the space that Opportunity Zone funds and potential social impact things like workforce housing or health or job creation, most of the focus I've seen is on, okay, how do we leverage this for housing? I have yet to see some really cool use cases for health or education. I have seen some interesting things develop in terms of job creation. Usually it is businesses that are wanting to expand. For example, in some communities here in Virginia, there are a number of manufacturing groups that are seeing this as an opportunity to increase their capacity. The other place that I've seen some interesting things start to happen is in renewable energy and specifically solar. There are a number of interesting ways to use this program for solar projects, both in terms of building out solar capacity, but also building out solar energy as an operating business. Those are some of the spaces that I've seen most of the activity. I haven't seen a lot of just pure small business type of funds put together yet. There's a challenge in terms of scale there, which is not surprising. but to me would be hugely impactful to the communities if we could collectively crack the code on that.
Very good. That is all the questions I have, and I know we're nearing the end of our time. I'll ask Adam for any final thoughts or suggestions for the group to consider.
No final words of wisdom other than to say please don't hesitate to reach out with questions. As I said, we here at Locust are working with a number of foundations and also localities to do a number of the things that I mentioned in the back part of this seminar, and would be glad to help kind of steer you or your communities as well. I guess my overarching thought is that I hope everyone leaves with it is a bit of what I just said, which is we have a powerful tool here to help rejuvenate some of our more distressed communities, but even though it's a free market program, I don't think the free market's going to help ultimately kind of get to the outcomes that we would like to see. It's going to need some intervention and leadership from a number of places, but most notably, I think, and most powerfully, from my perspective, it can come from the foundation space and philanthropy as a whole.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for your partnership on this webinar and the expertise and wisdom that you've shared with our group. I'll ask that those of you on the webinar please contact me if you have any future needs related to this topic in your own work that we can explore in a learning format similar to this or in another way with funders across the state. I will be sending a short evaluation along with the slides and the recording to the group so I can collect some additional feedback. A reminder that our January quarterly membership meeting will be on Thursday, January 31st at the Wellmark Foundation offices. GEO will be here to share with us their participatory grant-making workshop, how we put communities and nonprofits in the driver's seat of our work. So I hope you will join us for that. And I thank you for taking time to be with us this afternoon, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Take care.